All right, so here's how it all went down. Let's start with Smercanish.
This week, one of America's most esteemed public high schools got dragged into the swamp of our polarized national politics. New Trier in suburban Chicago is holding a day-long seminar this coming Tuesday. They call it Understanding Today's Struggle for Civil Rights. Now, a Wall Street Journal opinion piece referred to this as Racial Indoctrination Day.
So in early 2017, less than 30 days after Donald J. Trump became our 45th president of the United States, a racially charged controversy broke out on the wealthy North Shore of Chicago.
You can't bring anyone else in.
Few can remember a school board meeting in the New Trier district where parents had to be turned away at the door.
So many people showing up at tonight's meeting, the board meeting there, that the fire marshal had to be called in.
Some of the critics are planning to keep their kids home from school on seminar day, and they say more people aren't speaking up because they're afraid to be labeled a racist.
News coverage reported extensively on this controversy, which seemed to divide the township into camps along political lines.
The parents of New Trier Group, which is several hundred parents, say there isn't enough diversity.
We think that Seminar Day is great, but it's important to expose these kids here to a wide variety of voices.
The whole Seminar Day just seems to be focusing on color and race.
You can't make left or right out of it. You can't invite speakers that are telling the other side of racism.
The idea of shutting it down because they don't like some of the positions of some of the speakers seems ridiculous to me.
The story gained traction, first throughout Chicago and then in national news media, largely because of New Trier's cultural prominence.
The Winnetka School has too many famous graduates to list.
New Trier Township sits in the heart of the North Shore, which stretches along Lake Michigan from Evanston to Lake Forest. For movie fans, you'd probably know it as John Hughes country.
Well, Brian, this is a very nutritious lunch. All the food groups are represented.
Dozens of popular movies have been set on the North Shore, and many feature locations in New Trier Township. 16 Candles, Ferris Bueller's Day Off,
Bueller,
Uncle Buck, Home Alone. New Trier has also been consistently ranked one of America's best high schools for more than 60 years. And in all of that time, it's also been known for its lack of racial diversity. So this parental conflict over student programming on Martin Luther King Day made New Trier Township the perfect place for a national controversy on racial issues to break out, especially in the early days of the Trump presidency. And that's exactly how it played out. With the exception of one notable detail, the intense disagreement allegedly raging within the halls and homes of New Trier Township wasn't really happening. It was a long con. Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Long Con, the podcast that takes a lighthearted and informative look at the dismantling of American representative democracy and the collapse of Western civilization. My name is Paul Traynor. Glad to have you with us for this very first episode. I don't know why I chuckle when I say that because it's really not funny. But at any rate, that little intro gives you a sense of what we're talking about or where we're talking about it here. I live in New Trier Township. I am a New Trier parent, and I was sucked into this in early 2017, ended up making a documentary called New Trier Tip of the Spear about it, which you can actually watch on YouTube if you want to get up to speed. After Tip, I knew I'd only scratched the surface of this story, so we started working on another documentary, but the problem was it was just too hard to condense everything going on into a 90-minute feature. The way I kept describing it was that we were trying to make a molehill out of a mountain. I really hope we do get to produce this documentary in the near future because we have a lot of great footage and we put together a really fantastic team. I was lucky to meet a very talented producer and writer named Todd Cimino. T. Raphael Cimino is his professional name, and Todd has just been great, super smart guy. He's really opened some doors for us and been invaluable. Our director of photography, Christopher Lane, extremely talented DP and shooter. Kevin Veal, my friend and great cameraman who's helped us out. Brian Prey, who's served as an associate producer for us, and just a bunch of other great folks who've helped us out along the way. But right now, it felt very important in the state of the world to just put this thing out here and start this discussion. So, what is a long con? Well, a long con is an actual thing. Sometimes it's called a big con, but it means an elaborate confidence game that develops in several stages over an extended period of time, wherein the con men or swindlers gain the victim's trust with the goal of reaping an enormous payout in the game's final maneuver. So that is what is happening here in America, ladies and gentlemen. We believe it is a very concentrated effort by a very small group of extraordinarily wealthy Americans, billionaire Americans, what we believe are billionaire oligarch Americans, and the apparatus that they have put in place methodically and at great expense over time. And by time, I mean our lifetimes, 70 years, starting after the Second World War in the Eisenhower era, and then going all the way up to the present. They have slowly built this libertarian version of conservatism. They have gutted traditional conservatism. So the stakes are high, and we have to find a way, whatever our political opinions or beliefs are, to start getting along. So I would like to contribute to that in our first episode by pissing off quite a few of my neighbors. Actually, I don't think it is. I think it's a very small group of my neighbors, because this crazy thing that happened in New Trier Township right after Donald Trump became President of the United States really is not only illustrative of this greater long con. It was a long con perpetrated over a couple of months on our community here in New Trier Township, but the players involved are actually doing the same thing on a national scale. I've never been involved in politics. I'd never been, speaking out publicly or kind of, in the media world at all until this happened. And so it was all a little bit of a surprise to me. But basically, in early 2017, this group of parents emerged seemingly out of nowhere to take really strong issue with the plans for the Civil Rights Day here at New Trier High School. So once I noticed this on Facebook, I noticed a post coming up for a radio discussion that had kind of kicked everything off. And so we're going to kick off with that here too. And I think it's good just to kind of tell the story as it unfolded.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. Well, we talked about this a few days ago, this day-long seminar taking place at New Trier High School.
Why are we going to talk like this again? Because New Trier is one of the best mountain high schools in the state.
That looks like it hurts.
All school, it does hurt. All school seminar. I don't know how those wasps on the North Shore do it.
No, stop it.
All right, so there you go. That's Dan Proft. He and his co-host Amy Jacobson have a morning drive show in Chicago on conservative radio. Lots of political commentary and one really terrible accent he was doing there. Not exactly sure what it is, but just gives you a little flavor about the kind of guy Dan is. So Dan, on this particular morning, has found out about New Trier Seminar Day just through reading his morning paper, I guess. It just popped up in his news feed, and so he's a little concerned, and he and Amy then decide to find out what's going on by inviting a member of our community to join him to discuss it.
For more on this, because there are some parents who have challenged the regime at New Trier with respect to this mandatory indoctrination, and among them is Betsy Hart, who joins us now. Betsy, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me.
All you privileged white kids, apologize to us, and then go around the rest of your lives apologizing for who you are. Isn't that what this is?
You know, I'm not going to put words in their mouth, but I'm going to say that that actions do speak louder than words, and that's certainly, if that's not the intent, I do think that is going to be the effect. So what I'm encouraging, and I'm hearing from parents, some of whom are afraid to speak out publicly, understandably, about this, but are coming to me because I'm, sort of used to voicing my opinion, I suppose.
Okay, There you go. So we've got the two main players of the con that have just come out in the very first interview. We've got Dan Proft, the concerned outside newscaster, just paying attention to local issues. And then we've got this mother whose name is Betsy Hart, who is now involved with this group of parents who apparently just, came up to her because she'd spoken out about things and said, hey, will you be our spokesperson? And so they have this little organic group of parents who are concerned about what's happening at New Trier and just want to spread a little light on it, see if they can get a little balance in this oppressive day of discussion about racial civil rights.
You finally have people waking up and saying, wait a second, what am I destroying my home value for? What are we paying these exorbitant property taxes for exactly? What's my child being taught at New Trier? These leftist champagne socialists in New Trier. This is all racial indoctrination, left-wing activism, advocacy of socialism. That's what this race seminar day has turned into.
I think you can see where Dan's coming in on this day. So Dan and Betsy, the concerned mother, are our two main grifters. So Dan is playing the role of what is known as the shill. Now, in a con, the shill is the outside person, the seemingly outside person who has no apparent connection to the con, but just has a strong opinion or maybe can get the ball set in motion. So he's playing that role here. That's the outside man or the shill. So the plant or the inside man, in this case, is a woman, Betsy Hart. So she is the mom who's, just doing this because other moms asked her to. And we'll talk about Betsy in just a second. But first, a little bit about Dan Proft. So the first I know of Dan Proft was 2008, I think. He helped the town president, Larry Dominick of Cicero, Illinois, to gain re-election. And as a result, he then got no-bid contracts worth $578,000 a year to serve as the mouthpiece for the town and two local school districts. So not only is Proft's firm receiving $180,000 a year to boost Cicero town president Larry Dominick's agenda, but the town, in a highly unusual move, also agreed to pay the company another $308,000 a year to promote the new municipal complex. I don't even know what that is, but if you've heard of Cicero, you've probably heard of it because it was known as the home base and center of operations for Alphonse Capone and the Chicago outfit. So that's where Dan started out. A grifter? Seems likely, right? After that, he his star rose, but he made a star-crossed bid in 2010 to be the governor of the great state of Illinois. And again, the social skills you might have already sensed that Dan lacks were a bit of a problem there. So here he is from one of the debates in 2010.
Mr. Proft, your response.
Yeah, like everybody else, I was born a poor black child, too. I mean, this is exactly what this election is not about. These politicians' biographies, these navel-gazing bromides. This is about policy choices. So let me give you one that enfranchises people here that have gotten the shaft in this state. I'm the only candidate who has proposed a statewide opportunity scholarship program for low-income families who are disproportionately relegated to schools that we know will fail them.
Racist? Maybe. Funny? But an interesting side note about him wanting opportunity scholarships and making that a centerpiece of his campaign. This is definitely a more palatable way and one of the accepted ways to discuss school vouchers, school choice. So we will talk about that more as we go. But you know what? His campaign hit some bumps because his background kept dogging him.
You helped re-elect Cicero President Larry Dominick, who's the poster boy for corruption in this state, who then awarded you hundreds, thousands of dollars in no-bid contracts. Was that courage? Was that not wilting?
Here's the thing about Cicero. Cicero was a client. I was a vendor to the town of Cicero. If you don't like all of my clients, it's fine. I don't like all of my clients either. But I provided a service. I wasn't the town president. I wasn't a village trustee. I wasn't a policymaker. I was somebody who provided production of collateral, the development of a website, PR services. So, that's what I did. And those are professional services contracts, which are typically retained, not bid out.
This is really just kind of juvenile playground antics by a couple of brothers who I think, frankly, are jealous of Larry's position. So they're doing what they do. These are people that don't live in Cicero. They have no idea what's going on in Cicero.
There you go. All right. So Dan, didn't handle it too well. And there he goes. He thinks, I guess, being paid that kind of money in no-bid contracts is okay. Interesting, though, that he said people from outside of Cicero were giving him an issue about it and injecting themselves out of jealousy when they had nothing to do with the town of Cicero, because guess where Dan Proft doesn't live? New Trier Township or work. So anyway, that was Dan. But as I said, for every long con, there's got to be a person on the inside. So how did I know Betsy was the inside woman? Well, it was just a hunch at first, because her face and her voice were all over the place on Facebook. She was on the news and all this sort of thing. But then there were other clues in this particular interview.
Betsy, aren't the students required by the Board of Education, though, to enroll and have a social and emotional learning day?
Well, we're actually trying to get through some FOIA requests and find out exactly what is required. But if you're going to have a day that's structured like this, let's start with including parents. Parents were actively excluded. When I asked the assistant principal responsible for helping put this program together who did it, and he said, well, it was students and faculty. And I said, well, what about parents? Why aren't parents involved? And he said to me, because that's not how we do things.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, Betsy, do you have a PhD in education?
I know.
Well, then,
in education, right? Exactly. That's what they would say.
Well, then, how could you possibly know what's in the interests of your children in terms of their education if you're not a PhD in education? Betsy, these are their children. This is their time with your children to instruct them accordingly. And, if you want to go back to school so that you're on their intellectual level when it comes to the intellectual development of your children, well, that's a different thing. But until then, it's up to Monica Trinidad, Black Lives Matter, these overeducated, overcompensated bureaucrats at New Trier to decide how your children's lives will play themselves out.
See, now they're starting to go off on education. It's getting more political. And you'll notice here how Dan is positioning them as elites. And this is really important because that's part of their MO. They want to turn the common man against those, wealthy, snobby, intellectual or rich elites. And they've been really successful at it. But Betsy sure seems like she's prepared and comfortable for a larger political discussion, doesn't she? So I did a little bit of Googling about Miss Betsy Hart. And here's what I found out.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Betsy Hart, Director of Lectures and Seminars here at the Heritage Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you to Heritage and to today's program on confronting plantation politics, broadening debate within the African American community. For those of you not familiar with the Heritage Foundation, we are a nonpartisan public policy research institute here in Washington dedicated to the principles of free, competitive enterprise, individual liberty, limited government, and a strong national defense.
Okay, that was from 30 years ago, and I'm guessing that most of you are familiar with the Heritage Foundation at this point. In 1990, Betsy served as their coordinator of public events and speakers, and she was on it a bunch. You can find her all over C-SPAN. She came from the Reagan White House as a young whippersnapper and was still a very young political operative there at the Heritage Foundation, where she remained for 30 years. I think she's still there. I think she still does fundraising and some writing for them. But she certainly was at the time the tip of the spear was made. But she didn't happen to mention ever, as a parent, in any of her many appearances with Dan or on local news or at school board meetings, that she was, in fact, a 30-year-plus conservative, partisan political operative. It just never came up. But, I thought it was kind of germane. You might have noticed in that particular clip that she was moderating a discussion of all black speakers. If you want to see it on C-SPAN, you can, on the role of plantation politics in the Democratic Party. So, wow, clearly Betsy is not a stranger to discussions of civil rights.
Recent Supreme Court decisions on civil rights cases have sparked cries from the left that the Supreme Court is narrowing civil rights. Is the court really changing direction in such a way that will promote true civil rights and not favoritism and double standards?
So Betsy is the inside person. She's pretending to be just another mom at New Trier. Dan is the shill who's driving all of this, and they have a history of bashing progressives for exactly these types of issues before they brought them to New Trier. So we need to introduce one more character to the proceedings here, and that is the person in the con that is known as the fixer. So the fixer often works near the inside person or the outside person, the shill, but their job is to back up and coordinate resources as the con unfolds. And this was a guy from Dan's other show, not his morning show, but a podcast that he does that's sponsored by a conservative think tank in Illinois called the Illinois Policy Institute, and this gentleman's name is Pat Hughes.
Dan Proft back with Pat Hughes, co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project, and Pat talking about destroying your home value for what when it comes to K through 12 education. The curious case of New Trier High School, which is becoming a national story.
This has been going on, as you know, Dan, in college campuses for a while, but that's not good enough for the left. They need to do their indoctrination of prospective voters earlier, trying to indoctrinate 16, 17, and 18-year-old kids who are either voters or are going to be voters into a leftist cause, and frankly, a political party cause, a Democrat cause. If I have a 16-year-old and 14-year-old, two high school kids, I would never allow them to participate in this. Never. Because it's political indoctrination.
All right, so that's Pat Hughes, a man of strong convictions, and that's just fine. But he's the fixer, in my estimation. This is my opinion only, and for entertainment purposes only, for all of you lawyers listening. Pat is one of them, so if he's hearing this, sorry, Pat, but you're the fixer.
I'm not even sure it's necessarily legal. I think there's a chance here that it's violating the rights of the parents and the kids.
So the fixer needs a combination of skills, from grifting to putting pressure on the mark. They could be a little bit of the heavy sometimes. And this person frequently wears more than one alias during a con. So you notice there, Dan introduced him, usually as he does on this podcast, as the co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project. The other co-founder is Dan himself. He doesn't mention that, but that's a 501c4 political group that they run. More on that later. But in terms of having more than one alias, it turns out that Pat has another outfit that he works for, too.
Dan, as you know, I'm president of the Liberty Justice Center. Our goal is to, stop governments from taking away people's rights, right?
Right. So that's Pat Hughes' other gig. He's a lawyer for something called the Liberty Justice Center that does legal work to protect the rights of individuals. So he's affiliated with at least two entities that we know of, Illinois Opportunity Project and Liberty Justice. But he's also here now doing a segment for Upstream Ideas, which is yet another project he and Dan collaborate on that is sponsored by the aforementioned Illinois Policy Institute. Are you keeping all of this straight? Don't worry, you don't have to yet.
This is Pat Hughes with this week's Upstream Ideas 2-minute warning. So I bet you thought, or at least hoped, that liberal indoctrination in schools was limited to crazy college professors and their snowflake co-eds. If only. At New Trier High School, the leftist bureaucrats are forcing students to attend a seminar day on race, featuring lectures on systemic racism, white privilege, and unconscious bias. A group of parents urging administrators to add competing views, or at least let kids opt out of being called racist all day, have been dismissed by Yankee and her posse of overpaid radicals.
Okay, did you catch that? Pat took issue with three things: systemic racism, white privilege, and unconscious bias. And then he says that they want to offer competing views to systemic racism, white privilege, and unconscious bias because they won't accept that those things exist. Systemic racism does not exist. And denying this is simply to deny reality. Betsy took issue with this over and over throughout the course of these couple of months. Dan and Pat, of course, push back on the notion whenever it comes up, as does much of their libertarian section of the right. But the reality is not only is there systemic racism, but the North Shore of Chicago exists as it is almost exclusively because of systemic racism. Now, we don't have time in this episode to go down that particular rabbit hole, but there was a certain thing called redlining, if you're not familiar with it, that kept black people from getting mortgages in this area for 50 years. And it also kept black people from getting regular FHA loans even in poorer black areas, they got almost exclusively high-risk loans. The FHA, as a governmental organization, did not approve loans to black people in almost any circumstance, but certainly they did not let them buy up in this area. Most of these communities, Winnetka, Kenilworth, even here in Wilmette, had restrictive covenants in the deeds of these properties for many years, some as late as the 1980s. Some you can still find in the actual deeds if you look at them down at City Hall, which meant that it was against the law to sell to people of color. So this is systemic racism. You can say it's maybe better than it was, or that, it's not as much of an issue as people say, but to reject the idea that there is systemic racism is to just reject American history. So this is one of those things I think we really need to learn to talk about in ways that aren't accusatory, but that are honest and based on reality. So anyway, this was certainly my perspective, and it was at this point that I really became an active part of this story. Because I'd been so vocal about this on Facebook, and the Trib had gotten a quote from me, I was actually asked to go on a local PBS news show called Chicago Tonight to speak as a proponent of Seminar Day. This was my first time ever to be on television in this way, and I was the pro side of the discussion, and they got another parent to speak against Seminar Day. Guess who that was?
Joining us tonight with their thoughts on this upcoming controversial seminar are two New Trier parents. They are Betsy Hart. She is one of the organizers of a group called Parents of New Trier, and Paul Traynor, an actor and a filmmaker, and we thank you both for being here tonight.
I'm now hearing parents in the North Shore demonstrate racism in a way I hadn't seen before. I'm seeing them say, blacks should always think a certain way. Blacks all hate police. Blacks are all angry. And these are the blacks represented in Seminar Day.
Okay. So that was me and Betsy, and I wanted to talk about systemic racism, so I pushed the issue. Do you agree there's systemic racism? I think that's the clarification. You say there's racism, but do you think there's systemic racism?
Well,
because they've painted that as if that's a political issue, that systemic racism exists in terms of the prison system or the educational system or economics or any of these things, and they have very, very kind of extremist conservative speakers they'd like to inject who just happen to have black skin.
You are misrepresenting us entirely. We absolutely accept that there is racism,
Systemic?
but we want to look at it. If you're saying that all disparities between the races are caused by racism, no. In fact, what we argue is that when you get into that circle where you cannot look outside of it, you don't get to look at other solutions like
what circle
a bigger,
are you talking
like
about?
The circle that says if there's a difference between races, it is by definition racism. Instead of looking at things like bigger predictors of lifetime success,
I think
which are
made up that circle.
Excuse
That's
me,
not a real
Paul.
circle that
Excuse me.
I've heard anyone
Excuse me.
talking
Let me
about
ask you
in
another
the
question.
Excuse me. I want to break out of the. I want to talk about education. Talk about
Let me
black
ask
violence.
you what voices you
and
want.
helping.
Betsy, please.
So clearly, Betsy had a canned answer on systemic racism that I was able to derail a little bit. And yes, I was a bit pushy, I admit it, but it was clear from the beginning that Betsy just wanted to steamroll me and the host and just hit her talking points. And she was a pro. She's done this for years and years. You can see the whole clip of this on the Chicago Tonight website. The interview got pretty tense, I have to admit, but I did get to share my belief in what was really happening. I believe that this is part of a large-scale assault by Betsy and people from outside of our district to attack public education. There's 1% of opposition
Betsy,
against
very quickly, your final point.
It is non-political.
This is an offensive ad hominem attack, which suggests the fact that people, instead of engaging in debates on the merits, are attacking us, and this is what we have seen all along to keep our voices out, and this is from the people who actually claim to be open-minded.
Betsy
It's
Hart
really
and Paul
offensive.
Traynor, this is the most liveliest debate we've had on here, and hopefully we made some sense along the way.
Spirited is right. So this was a very spirited discussion. Right after they called cut, Betsy threw down her mic and stormed off set and called me a bully. She may be right, but, takes one to know one, Bets. And apparently me saying that she was attacking public ed and the kids' teachers was offensive to her, extremely offensive, but all of the language that she and Dan and Pat were spewing about liberal indoctrination and radical leftists and champagne socialists and greedy school teachers, all that's just fine. Nothing offensive in that. These are the kids, the people that teach our kids. So I was kind of offended on their behalf, but, to each his own. So after this appearance, I'd started to make a video basically for my neighbors and other parents in New Trier Township because I wanted to just show them this, hurricane of fucking lies, to quote Green Day, that was going on here. But as I went, it morphed into a much bigger project. And as that happened, I started a Kickstarter to make a documentary. And the day before Seminar Day happened, I was asked to go on Steve Cochran's show. It was my first radio interview. It was recorded at the WGN building on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. If you've ever been down there, it's the one that's right on the river, right across from the Tribune building. And there's actually a window of the studio that looks out onto the Mag Mile. And if you're, as a tourist on Michigan Avenue, you can look in and see what they're talking about. And I've done that. But that day, I was that person. And I was able to share what I thought was going on without Betsy, the angel of doom, sitting over my right shoulder.
We have not seen any numbers that refute the numbers you've brought us, and that being that the kids, the faculty, the school itself, and the community itself, I should say, are vastly in favor of going ahead with Seminar Day. It's going to happen, obviously, but I mean going in favor with Seminar Day, and people generally are in the confused state that I come into this with, which, where's the problem?
Yeah, it's very confusing. There's 100-to-1 support if you look at the small group that's against this filed federal, Information Act request with New Trier Township, and all of the data showed, the emails, the phone calls, 100-to-1 support. My theory is that this is kind of a concentrated and orchestrated effort, and that they're not even really trying to make anything happen in New Trier Township. They're playing to a statewide and a nationwide audience. And honestly, if you only hear a soundbite and you only hear a little bit about this here and there, you'd think, oh, there's this raging controversy. And boy, yes, both sides should be, represented. But, to me, this is the narrative of the false equivalency. There's 100-to-1 support for it. So that means anyone who's progressive and anyone who's conservative and anyone who's moderate in the main supports this. And this tiny, tiny group that doesn't support this, that is filled with professional conservative media personalities, pundits, and like you said, big PAC money. I mean, Dan Proft came and was live tweeting from our event. He's had it on his radio show multiple times. It's been in the little North Cook News pamphlet, which looks like news to me, but I'm not sure it is.
Where will you be tomorrow?
Hiding under my bed with the lights off.
Back with the big story next. Mayor Rahm Emanuel in 10 minutes on 720 WGN.
All right, so I was kidding about hiding under the bed. Kind of. But I was definitely on their radar now. Because within an hour or so of me appearing on Steve Cochran's show, suddenly, guess who was talking about me? Dan Proft.
So again, just so you understand this story as it continues to receive a lot of press, and I know there's this guy named Paul Traynor, a New Trier leftist who's running around to the other stations, blasting me and, being the typical left-wing bedwetter, trying to mischaracterize the issue. The issue is this. Go have your seminar day. No problem. We want more speech, not less speech.
All right. So a lot of the ins and outs of all this are in the New Trier Doc Tip of the Spear. Won't go into detail, but I would just like to put it together that in addition to Dan's radio show and Pat Hughes' various organizations, that Dan and Pat both worked for a think tank I'd mentioned called the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, this is the biggest conservative think tank in the state of Illinois, and it's part of something larger on a national level called the State Policy Network, which is a group of similar libertarian conservative think tanks, and they're in every single state in America, except for, I think, North Dakota. And they are extremely tightly interwoven. The State Policy Network, I'd never heard of it, but they are huge. They are interconnected. They share resources, staff, and most importantly, they share donors. So this was the point, really, when I first realized the actual scale of this vast network and the insane amount of money that they had to spend. So Dan Proft was a senior fellow at the Illinois Policy Institute, which means that he's one of the guys not only jabbering on the radio, but who's setting and disseminating conservative policy, and his aggressive and combative form of libertarianism, had really risen to the foreground of the party in the age of Trump, to be sure. There's a lot of guys like Dan out there. But you're one in a million, Dan. No one's quite like you, buddy. So Dan got money for being a fellow, I'm sure. He also had a couple of other media companies that received consulting and media production fees from Illinois Policy and their various entities. Again, probably no-bid contracts from nonprofit organizations, which the Illinois Policy Institute is. But hey, I'm not here to call anyone a criminal, just a shill and a grifter. So anyway, Illinois Policy underwrote Dan and Pat's Upstream Ideas show and also at the Illinois Opportunity Project. But even crazier than all of this is that Dan is the president and treasurer of the Liberty Principles PAC here in the great state of Illinois. So Liberty Principles is a super PAC, a political super PAC, and it is rich. They've received more than $10 million, and by they I mean Dan. You can look at this on the Illinois Sunshine or whatever the website is to see this. Dan had received, like within that year that I was talking to him, $10 million. He is the treasurer and president of this super PAC, and as far as I know, it's just wired into his account, and then he spends it as he wants to. Maybe that's not how it goes, but you know what? Super PACs don't have to tell you that, so if you can get Dan to tell you, that's more than I was able to do. But as I mentioned on Steve Cochran, it is this PAC, I think, that funded yet another project of Dan's, completely different, independent government news services. So this is actually a string of 20 local, quote-unquote, newspapers that are all over Illinois. They're in all kinds of different towns throughout the state. They spread disinformation, and they have very aggressive political content. Much of it is the same in each of these papers. They aggregate it. They have it written by ghostwriters in the Philippines. It's all very anti-tax, anti-government, and it's presented as if it's local news from a local paper, like your Pioneer Press or whatever. So the one in New Trier Township is called North Cook News, and it ran actually more than a dozen stories on Seminar Day in January and February leading up to the Seminar Day program. This was part of the long con. So, North Cook News.
Again, a paper that I co-founded, northcooknews.com. More on this, North Cook News. And in northcooknews.com, one of my papers, check out our product, northcooknews.com, my product. I'll take ownership of it. I've been covering it in my paper, northcooknews.com, the story of the New Trier racist seminar. It's my description of it. Because,
what's it really called?
Because it's accurate.
It's the...
I don't know. My outlet, northcooknews.com.
Side hustle.
Side hustle is right, Amy. So Dan has spent some of his $10 million in cash on North Cook News, I guess. He was even venturing into a local Facebook group that was like a parents group designed for New Trier parents for us to discuss Seminar Day. And he and I got into it there a little bit. And then he messaged me, actually. He invited me to call into his show with he and Amy to talk about things after Seminar Day. And I was already making a video, working on it. So I think he was a little surprised when I messaged right back saying, I'd love to, but can I come in person? So anyway, I think Dan was surprised, but he was gracious. And I think he's nothing if not confident in his own abilities. So he invited me in, perhaps not knowing the full extent of my agenda, which I'm ready to admit to now.
For an opposing viewpoint on the topic, we're pleased to be joined by Paul Traynor, who is also a New Trier parent, the father of a sophomore at New Trier High School, as well as an incoming freshman at New Trier. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan. Nice to be here. It feels like this is a controversy that is being ginned up by outside influences, and particularly, with all due respect, yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You've injected yourself into this local issue.
The Parents of New Trier group, that is a local group, that's New Trier parents, that you've denigrated and suggest that they are 1% of the opinion on this issue. And I'm not sure that the percentage they represent matters. We're talking about something based on the substantive fairness or lack of fairness of it. I go back again to ask why not more speech as opposed to constricting speech? Why not more participants? Why not extend the parameters of discussion on the Seminar Day?
I would say that I think that's a fair point, quite honestly. I do. And I think that that's a discussion that people of good faith can have. But I would also submit with, all due respect that if there's, any person in the state of Illinois that we don't need more speech from on this issue, it would probably be you, Dan.
Well, I know, because you don't like my speech, and that's fine.
You have a $10 million war chest that you got in the last year from Governor Rauner and from, Richard Uihlein and Todd Ricketts. So, to say that there's this big scale indoctrination, I mean, you're getting paid from very wealthy, deep-pocketed, outside, very conservative voices to make this a national issue. And I would suggest the only reason it's been on TV is because, you keep talking about it.
Well, I appreciate the power you think I have. Thank you for the
That's
credit.
a lot of money. How many hours have you spent talking about this? You think there's so much risk in this one day and this handful of seminars these kids will do that you need to, democracy is under attack and you have to be the champion of, conservative principles?
Well, Paul, since you're so good at connecting dots that don't exist, why try to connect some that do? This is a microcosm of a larger issue, and a larger discussion about K through 12 education and what's going on in schools. It just happens because of New Trier's national standing and because of its state standing. This is a good opportunity to talk about all of these issues that extend well beyond the corporate boundaries of New Trier Township High School.
All right, so there it was, right there. You heard it. Dan says explicitly and completely unprompted that New Trier is a high-profile target for a larger national discussion on public education. This is after they'd called me a conspiracy theorist for a month for suggesting that exact thing. But I couldn't figure out why they wanted to bash Seminar Day. Like, why would they devote so many resources toward attacking a single day of civil rights programming at a school? Why would they take the heat for appearing racist? Why would they go into all of this? It still didn't add up. But that's when I realized the common thread that ran through all of their efforts.
Talking about things like choice in education, changing the terrible schools in the inner city. You know, the teachers' unions, of which the teachers up here, here in the North Shore are members, they oppose choice in education.
Much attention is focused on the totalitarian re-education camps that college campuses have become, but it's in K-12 where the indoctrination has generally begun. A case study is New Trier High School.
Rather than race bait in their cozy enclave, they should have hard conversations with the union bosses who represent them and the Democrat politicians they support, who have caused the very problems they claim to care about.
So basically now we've got the agenda of this push against Seminar Day laid bare. It is an attack on the teachers' unions, which are a very powerful bloc with money and clout and are really the only entity that has enough money and power to kind of counteract the billionaire funding that pours through groups like Dan and Pat's and Betsy's. But also an attack on public education itself, which is one of the main goals of this policy combine. So policy combine is a term that I think I've coined basically to describe something I think we all know exists, but I don't believe it's had a name put to it up until now, at least not one that I've seen, which is this vast interconnected web of conservative libertarian groups that all exist primarily and exclusively, really, to carry the water for very small billionaire interests and to keep them from being taxed, to keep them from being regulated, and to roll back any laws or regulations that would cost them money or inhibit their power or freedom to do what they want. In Illinois, those are run by a guy named John Tillman. So here's one more name to remember. And John is the grifter of the grifters. He is the boss to Dan and Pat in all of these organizations. He runs Liberty Justice. He runs Illinois Policy Institute. And he works on a national level to generate millions and millions of dollars from these billionaire oligarchs to go out and do their bidding under the guise of charity. Because these are all charity organizations. And if you don't know this, you should, that the Heritage Foundation, Americans for Prosperity, Illinois Policy Institute, the Federalist Society, which is where all of these judges in the new Trump District Court, Judge Mill and Brett Kavanaugh, of course, have come from, they are all 501c3 charities that are prohibited by law from engaging in political activity. But they can talk about policy, and that's what they do. So this is an event that they held in Milwaukee during the Trump election in 2016 called Blue Lakes, Red States. And it was a little group of State Policy Network executives that got together with a couple of billionaire funders, and they had this little conference in terms of how to plan how to turn the Great Lakes red for Trump, which they ended up actually doing. And this has not been remarked on or talked about in the press very much. But if you've ever been to like a conference for work, an annual meeting or a sales kickoff or any kind of rah-rah big corporate event where they spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to bring everybody to Vegas or Phoenix or Orlando, and they put you in a ballroom and they play this big dramatic and moving video to kick everything off, and then you hear about all their big plans. This is what they do at these conferences, and there are dozens of them every year, sponsored by all the different entities. Here at State Policy Network, being hosted by the Bradley Impact Fund. So the Bradley Family Foundation in Milwaukee is another one of these things you've never heard of. You don't have to remember it right now, but they have an almost $1 billion endowment, and they spend it to support very anti-tax, very conservative causes. So here's how they kick off this event.
In an age where direction is sought from Washington too often by too many, we must remind ourselves of the intent of our founding principles. The Constitution's framers were not fans of powerful, centralized government. They believed in federalism, which maintains the majority of power in the hands of states and individuals. Conservative citizens recognize and respect this principle. They have masterfully applied it in advancing conservative policy. Even as liberals push Washington's overreach into our lives. With the help of the Bradley Foundation and the Bradley Impact Fund, conservative state policy organizations have had many wins in recent years, especially in the Midwest. We've realized wins in education choice and battles against big labor. In the battle against Obamacare and other federal intrusions, state think tanks have done much of the heavy lifting. Politics matter. Policy matters more. No matter the outcomes of November 8th, state think tanks will continue to research and implement conservative ideals in exactly the way our founders had intended, not from Washington, but from individual states. We at Bradley and the Bradley Impact Fund hope you will join us in recognizing and supporting these outstanding resources. Together, we can help keep our Great Lakes blue and our states red.
So the amazing thing about this is clearly they're spending a lot of money on production values. Clearly they're wanting to blow a lot of smoke up the asses of the people that are going to be there to write them checks. But it's a small group of people. They spend huge amounts of money really just to curry favor and, try to get the attention of and stroke the egos of the ultra rich. And they do it in a lot of different instances. So this was one. And the interesting thing about it is, if you see this Vimeo link, it's actually on the page of the Bradley Impact Fund, and then there's a link you can click on the Vimeo page to the audio of the event. But if you click it, it says, sorry, this link does not exist. And there's a good reason for that, which we discovered when the folks at Center for Media and Democracy, a watchdog in Madison, gave me a link to the actual discussion. And I'm going to play a little bit for you here. Remember, these are all 501c3 charities that are prohibited by law from engaging in politics.
We have 4 outstanding individuals here who head up state-based think tanks in the Midwest. John Tillman, the CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute. Mike Nichols, president of the Wisconsin Policy Research Institute. Joe Lehman, who's the president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. And Robert Alt, who's the president of the Buckeye Institute.
Mr. Petty. Señor Petty. Regional Vice President of the Pan American Mining Corporation. Regional de la Pan American Mining Corporation. Mr. Robert Allen of South American Sugar. Señor Robert Allen de la South American Sugar. And Mr. Michael Corleone of Nevada. Y señor Michael Corleone de Nevada. Representing our associates in tourism and leisure activities. Yeah.
Mr. Petty. Señor Petty. All right, I'm just kidding about those last 3. But it kind of has that vibe, doesn't it? Sorry, anyway, back to the proceedings.
So we have state-based think tanks represented here from Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio. I'm going to kick this off by calling on John Tillman.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the Bradley Foundation, Bradley Impact Fund, for all the support they've given to all 4 of us. It's been instrumental in our development. But as we heard this morning, the very sobering panel and discussion this morning, we have to win presidential elections, speaking abstractly, of course, in a C3 environment. And so the key to all of this, to improving how fertile the ground is for a pro-freedom, pro-liberty agenda and political actors to advance it, is on strategic philanthropy. And in each of our states, strategic philanthropy was critically important to the development of the think tank community. And it is the think tank community that begins the permanent infrastructure of making that ground fertile.
All right, so here John Tillman is thanking the donors for philanthropy, right? So that means their political spending. So John is promising a return on investment for their philanthropy, their charitable, quote unquote, political spending. And you see that basically, he makes that little crack about, speaking of the politics in the abstract as a 501c3, and there's a little chuckle, ha 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 ha. And that's funny because he's breaking the law right there. That is illegal. What John Tillman is doing there is basically making a joke out of the fact that what is supposed to be a nonpartisan, non-political policy organization is really just a fixture and a mouthpiece to advance the agenda of this tiny billionaire class. And lest you have any doubts that this was somehow a slip of the tongue or whatever, here's another fundraising video that's actually from the State Policy Network website, spn.org.
America's the most charitable country in the world. No country comes close. Our spirit of generosity has always been connected to our freedom.
Passionate leaders and passionate supporters who had the same goal in mind, to make America more free, who started this with a dream, just like the leaders in the movement.
Okay, one more quick timeout. That is Tracy Sharp. She is the woman who is the president of the State Policy Network, the umbrella organization for all of these think tanks. And I just have to say, how kind of that fawning, creepy tone when she says, just like the leaders of the movement. I don't know, is that just me? Or is that creepy as fuck? I don't know. Anyway, here is John making the salient point in this video.
We're going to a donor who cares about the ideas we care about. They happen to have money, we have expertise and capacity. We are making a deal together and we are partners.
They have money, we have capacity and expertise. It is a partnership and we are making a deal. You don't really hear people talk about deal making in most charity videos, do you? It's a business deal. It's not really a charity. It's not really philanthropy. It's a business deal. And it exists only to serve the interests of these very rich billionaire Republicans, and not the rank and file conservatives, not your friendly neighbors who are in the Republican Party, not those of you listening who are in the Republican Party, unless some of you billionaires are out there. No, these are very particular guys who have weaponized philanthropy and are using it to enrich themselves.
And I'll conclude by saying that, and I did this with his permission, of course, that Dick Uihlein, his wife Liz is here today, has been our strategic philanthropist for us. He wrote the very first check to us for $50,000 in the summer of 2007 as our anchor donor and a visionary philanthropist. Illinois would not be making the progress it is, and you'll be hearing more about our progress in the coming years, without a strategic thinker like Dick and the big investments he's made in our work that allowed us to prime the pump and have the working capital necessary. But I think it's all true for all of us, and political acts will not happen without this kind of investment.
At the end there, you hear that John gives a special shout out to Dick Uihlein. So Richard Dick Uihlein is one of the most influential billionaires that you never heard of, and he's a local guy, so he tied into our story. He's from Lake Forest, Illinois, which is actually not in New Trier Township. It's a little further up the North Shore. If you think of us as John Hughes area, Lake Forest is ordinary people and risky business area. That's the old money. So Uihlein is the one who gave $10 million to Dan's personal war chest, the Illinois Liberty Principles PAC. And Dick Uihlein was also the single biggest donor to Judge Roy Moore's election campaign, if you'll remember that, from 2018, when that charming pedophile judge shit show who was running for office, and everyone but Trump and the most diehard Republicans ran away from him. So anyway, I'm going to do a video on Dick Uihlein shortly. His company is Uihlein, the office supplies company. But the focus here is the SPN, or the State Policy Network. So this is the spine, the very spine of what I call the policy combine, and this is how blatant they are in their big donor funding appeals. So here's another super slick, highly produced donor vid they made, and it has, a who's who of conservative politics. And again, this is all allegedly nonpartisan, a charity, and they're asking billionaires to support their charity.
The people that work in the State Policy Network organizations have one agenda, and that's to put freedom at the front of the line.
And so when you lead with stories, you lead with that emotional appeal, knowing that you've got the reason and the logic to back it up, you can really change lives for the better.
What's so different about the state policy groups is they're saying, spend less. They're really representing the taxpayers of the state that are, quite frankly, not normally represented in the state capitol.
And I think having a network of people who are committed to that and then who talk to others about saying, how did you find success in your state or region versus elsewhere, is incredibly valuable in pursuing that.
It helps make democracy work and helps restore good government. So I'm a big advocate, big ally for the network of think tanks and their communication with each other.
All right, there you go. You got John Tillman kicking it off. You got Stephen Moore, that wacky Heritage Foundation economist who was laughed out of his being floated as a potential czar for Trump. You've got Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. You've got Bruce Rauner, who is, I don't think he's a billionaire, poor Bruce. I think he's a multi-millionaire. But he was still able to buy the governorship of Illinois a few years back. It may not surprise you to hear that Rauner is from New Trier. He is a New Trier Republican. But at any rate, one of the very first things that Bruce Rauner did when he became governor of Illinois was file a lawsuit against the public unions. Surprise, surprise. And this is an interview that he gave to Fox News on this subject.
Well, Governor, I hear from a lot of these public union workers who are saying, well, wait a minute, this is really a not-so-veiled attempt just to crush unions. You say what?
I say absolutely not. I filed this original lawsuit when I first became governor of Illinois 3 years ago because I believe it's about freedom of speech and freedom of political association. It is unfair for a government union to force government employees to pay dues when many of them do not agree with the political positions of that union. And in fact, all government unions, by the nature of their work, are political, 100% in everything they do.
What he's talking about, this manipulation of the average working man, let's be clear. This was a well-established labor law that had been upheld by the Supreme Court for decades. And it wasn't making people join the unions. It was saying that the unions could actually, take contributions when they were collective bargaining out of the paychecks of people who were benefiting from them. And so that was the First Amendment rights, that these people who were having the unions advocate for them to get them better working conditions or make more money were being mistreated and abused by that. So whether you intellectually think that the union should have that ability to take the money is one thing, but let's be clear about what it really was. Now it was time to roll the dice on this case, and that's how John Tillman became involved, because Bruce Rauner filed this case, but he didn't have standing. He wasn't involved, so they needed to find someone to hang this case on so that they could actually spend all this money to try to get it to SCOTUS and ram through this change, and that's just what they did, thanks to John Tillman.
And in our conversations with the governor and others, we realized, and the governor realized, that he was going to get bounced from the case because he had no standing because he didn't actually pay union dues. So we worked with the governor's team and some others, and we eventually all decided to intervene in that case. So the Liberty Justice Center, where I'm chairman, and the Illinois Policy Institute, where I'm the CEO, we worked together to eventually find Mark Janus.
So this was a real jaw-dropper to me as I completed Tip of the Spear to discover that John Tillman had found Mark Janus, a public union employee in Illinois, to become the plaintiff for what became the Supreme Court case known as Janus versus AFSCME. This is a landmark case that ultimately came up to the Supreme Court in 2018 once Neil Gorsuch had become the swing vote on Trump's Supreme Court, and it was passed on a 5-4 ruling that, in fact, made it no longer legal for unions to take funds to collectively bargain from people who didn't want to join the unions. Whatever opinion you have on unions is valid, but the key thing to know here is that this decision reversed over 20 solid years of Supreme Court precedent on labor law. So what was the political effect? Well, Judge Andrew Napolitano weighed in on Fox News.
Judge, have you considered the financial impact of a ruling like this on unions in America?
The court has not considered it, but for us to consider it, and the unions know this, the word is catastrophic. If you look at it from Republican versus Democrat, as you were just discussing with Andy McCarthy, because of some crazy phenomenon where blue-collar union members tend to be more Republican, but their labor union leaders tend to be more Democratic. This is catastrophic. for the Democrats.
Thank you, sir. Instant analysis, as we say. Thank you, Judge.
Judge, thank you.
Okay, and it seems like I'm going off the rails here, but I promise I'm not, because guess who represented Mark Janus in his landmark case?
Patrick Hughes Liberty Justice Center represents the Illinois state worker.
Our client, Mark Janus, just wants to be able to make a choice about whether he supports the union. Currently, he's being forced to support the union, and nobody in our country, no matter what walk of life they're from, what they do for work, should be forced to associate with a group that they don't want to associate with. It's un-American.
It's our buddy, the fixer, Pat Hughes. So, ladies and gentlemen, these folks are manipulating our entire country, and they get very, very rich by doing this. You know, the John Tillmans, the Dan Profts, the Pat Hughes, and the funding that they get comes from this tiny group of billionaires and extremely high-worth donors that are giving them literally billions of dollars. Billions. It sounds crazy to say that, but you know what? They're receiving trillions of dollars in return. And if you remember, we were actually warned about these guys because they were doing this 25 years ago, and Hillary Clinton mentioned it.
The great story here, for anybody willing to find it and write about it and explain it, is this vast right-wing conspiracy.
That's right. We all remember the vast right-wing conspiracy, which was met roundly with scorn and derision. I think I thought it was silly at the time, too, but doesn't seem so crazy now, does it? I mean, look what happened to Hillary. So Hillary loses, Trump gets in. Trump's tax cut alone was a 1.7, 1.something trillion dollar windfall for the 0.01% to these billionaire oligarchs. So they're not the 0.01%, or the billionaire oligarchs. So there are just over 600 billionaires in the United States right now. Maybe it's 650. But they represent, I did the math on this, the 0.00001%. So that is 1/1,000,000th of 1%. That's who this large cross-section of the real workers of America whose voices can't be heard. They got over $1 trillion back. In fact, according to an analysis in Forbes from last fall in 2018, for the first time ever in U.S. history, the top 400 wealthiest Americans, so that's, not even all these billionaires, but the top 400 of them paid a lower income tax rate than any other group. That's right, any other group. They paid less as a tax rate than the working poor, any other group. And I'll link to the Forbes article so you can read that for yourself. And the just released Trump budget just came out for 2020. You might have seen that last week. It shows that Trump wants to make his tax cuts for this group permanent. And this will be a cost of $1.4 trillion to U.S. taxpayers. $1 trillion. It's hard to wrap your head around this, but they can spend billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions on all of this policy combine, right? They can spend, money till the doors come off and the cows come home, produce these videos, have these events, hold these conferences, hire John Tillman and phalanxes of dancing girls, whatever they want to do, and they will still make huge money. They'll generate windfalls for themselves that make it look like peanuts. They work in secret. They cater all their efforts to this tiny group. Their media comes into New Trier and places like that to try to turn average people against each other and create fake controversies. This is the long con. The policy combine is doing the work, and they are making tons of money off it. Because where is Trump cutting taxes, right? If you see this, he's cutting taxes for the wealthy and ever, but where is he cutting tax benefits, I should say? On the poor, on the sick, on the hungry. We've demonized Obamacare. They are demonizing SNAP. They've demonized, TANF and welfare. The working folks who actually pay their taxes, who pay more in taxes comparatively than the billionaires pay. So this brings us to the final topic for our inaugural episode, and I'm sure you're thinking, whew, that can't get here fast enough. But I hope you're having fun. Don't worry, there is sunshine here too. There is good news. The first step is we have to diagnose the problem. So it's really important that we do that, and that's what we're doing here in our first episode. So the last topic we want to talk about is the education industrial complex. Now, you've all heard of the military industrial complex, right? That's the one that Ike warned us about back in the 1950s in his farewell address, which actually was the beginning of this long con that made the wealthiest Americans, the billionaires and their parents, turn against Eisenhower and call him a communist. That is true. The John Birch Society started out by calling Eisenhower a communist. And one of the funding members of that was Fred Koch, whose sons Charles and David stuck around and became pretty influential in their own right. So more on that later. But you remember the military-industrial complex means socialized expense, taxpayer dollars, for privatized gain and profits. So this is the real socialism in America, right? If there is socialism in America, this is it. We all foot the bill through taxes, and then the billionaires take the profits. I mean, again, if you look at Trump's new budget, the 2020 budget, they're saving billions on military spending to fund this tax cut by removing troops from conflict areas all over the globe, particularly in the Middle East. But at the same time, they're increasing military spending on missile defense systems and also the Space Force, the new Space Force. So where will those billions of dollars go? Well, I think we all know that. They're going to go into the pockets of private defense contractors. This is corporate socialism. So that's the military-industrial complex. We've also learned in recent years, of course, about the prison-industrial complex from journalists and amazing filmmakers like Ava DuVernay. If you have not seen the film 13th, you should stop listening to this and go watch it immediately. It's basically about how black men are used as commodities to feed a prison system that, once again, these billionaires and policy combine hacks are trying to privatize. Taxpayer funding and private profit. Another sterling example of corporate socialism. But there's a third big industrial complex that is happening now. It's been happening for 50 years, but it's really kicking in high gear now, and that is the educational industrial complex. Public education. So much bigger profits than prison. A lot more kids in schools than prisons still at this point anyway. And it might even be bigger than defense contracts. I know it's a several billion-dollar industry. And they look at it as that, as an untapped market worth billions. So public education, and specifically privatizing the public education system, is something that the policy combine promotes to advance billionaire objectives in lots of ways. So cultural agendas, social agendas, many of them, like the DeVosses, are Christian evangelicals. Dick Uihlein is as well. And at least in its early phases, it fits the same familiar profile, because what they're doing is they're taking poor children, particularly children of color, brown and black children, and they're making them the grist for this school choice mill. Now, they will say that the children and parents in these groups are the consumers. They're not. They're not the customers. They are the product. The customers are all of the different private organizations, nonprofit and profit alike, that are creating unregulated educational outfits to, bleed all these tax dollars. And some of them have good intentions, and many of them don't. But they've been working against public ed and unions for years and years. Again, not just to kneecap the teachers' unions so they don't have any political opposition, but also because the fight against public education is kind of perfect for them, because it really is like their holy grail, because it fits all of their desires. It ticks all the boxes for greed, for control, for dismantling of government, and elimination of property taxes to fund schools. So this all comes together in this one issue. All right, so here's old bets at the Heritage Foundation from nearly 30 years ago in 1992.
A new civil rights movement is taking place out in real America that focuses on economic empowerment and argues for providing choices and deregulation in such areas as housing, education, and small business, where government has often exercised excessive control. A perfect example of this was seen last week in Milwaukee, where inner-city parents and children fought and won in court to allow an educational choice and voucher program which had been approved by the legislature to go into effect. Interestingly, those African-American parents fought in conjunction with such conservative legal groups as the Landmark Legal Foundation for Civil Rights, and against such groups as the NAACP and the National Education Association, the liberal establishment, which did not want these inner-city youth to have choices and to be empowered.
So they started to push legislation for school vouchers in Milwaukee. They actually started 10 years earlier, but their first success was in Milwaukee in 1991. But like I said, that was 10 years in the making. So the very first stop that I made myself after TIP was I went up to Madison to find out more about this, and I actually sat down with Mary Batari. She's from that media watchdog that I mentioned, the Center for Media and Democracy, and this is just a little bit of the interview and what Mary told me.
In 1981, Alec had sent out a model bill about this wonderful model voucher program that people should enact. And at that time, they thought it would be a good idea to get this sort of radical proposal through the legislature if they wrapped it in the cover of being a sort of social mobility ticket for poor inner city youth, which in Milwaukee means mostly poor black children. So you can introduce a voucher program as a social mobility ticket for poor youth. You can introduce it as for special needs kids or for foster kids or for veterans kids, but it never stops there. So the next step on the Bradley Foundation agenda was to get it to expand it to religious schools. And so in 1998, it was expanded to religious schools. There was a major lawsuit. Opponents of that idea lost that lawsuit, and it got expanded to mostly Catholic schools in Wisconsin. And the goal is to have a top-to-bottom universal voucher program, because all along the goal has been so that rich white people living in the suburbs or wherever they live, going to private schools and sending their kids to private schools are subsidized by this program. That has always been their goal. And now, for the first time, people are talking about it that way. So you can see in Alec documents and in Alec bills, they're talking about universal vouchers now, universal vouchers.
All right, so Mary repeatedly mentions Alec in this clip, ALEC. Alec stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council. If you know who they are, then a shiver has probably run down your spine. If you don't, you can Google it. They did a great intro to them on John Oliver's show, a deep dive that was scary and funny and horrible. And we included a bit of that in Tip of the Spear. But I found this local news story from Atlanta that actually explains it super well and succinctly, and it's with an actual Georgia state senator named Nan Orrick, who was a member of Alec.
What is Alec?
It's really a corporate bill mill. I mean, they're cranking out legislation, putting it in the hands of legislators who go back and file it.
Georgia Senator Nan Orrick would know. She was once an Alec member. What happens in these back rooms?
And there are votes taken that have the corporate folks at the same table voting with the legislators on what bills to pick. And that at its core just screams out inappropriate.
You're telling me that in these rooms, a corporation has an equal vote with a legislator on a piece of legislation?
They absolutely vote, and the truth be told, they write the bills.
Alec bills come complete with blanks where legislators need only fill in their state name, like the Asbestos Claims Priorities Act. This Georgia law that now prevents many asbestos victims from suing corporations matches the Alec bill clause after clause, often word for word.
So you may think we're digressing completely here, and you may well be asking also, why the hell do the people of Georgia want or need an Asbestos Claims Priority Act? I mean, seriously. I mean, these are like cartoon villains, these people. But you know what? There's a little more.
The final vote was taken here at the Georgia Capitol, but the bill was first approved here, inside a Las Vegas casino at a closed-door Alec meeting. Records show the 3 Georgia senators who sponsored the bill received more than $22,000 in Alec scholarships to attend resort meetings the year before, during, and after the asbestos law was passed. This is money from corporations to legislators, but it's being filtered through Alec, and they get a tax write-off?
Well, Alec is a 501c3 organization, charitable educational purposes.
That's right. Alec is an educational charity. The signature of Georgia's Speaker of the House, David Ralston, appears on this 2013 Alec fundraising letter. He writes, "Your support of the scholarship fund is critical, enabling Georgia legislators to attend the annual meetings. Donations are 100% tax deductible and fund education efforts for legislators."
Okay, so Alec means that corporations write the laws and they hand them to legislators who are funded and bought and paid for by these billionaire oligarchs and the policy combine, who then bring them in for votes to state houses and to the U.S. Capitol. And a lot of times they do this allegedly without even reading them first. So here's a journalist named Lee Fang.
What does the State Policy Network do in relation to Alec?
In a nutshell, the State Policy Network is basically the PR firm for Alec. While Alec will draft a legislation or a piece of legislation that benefits a certain corporate interest, SPN will set up a think tank in a state capital, create policy papers to support that policy, op-eds, place media pieces supporting that policy, and then aggressively lobby the legislature to see it enacted. So they're taking what Alec creates and putting their weight into making it law.
All right, folks, so this is what we mean on the long con when we say that there is now a shadow state in America. This is a fully functioning, top-down entity being run by unelected billionaire oligarchs. They host hundreds of events each year, SPN conferences, Alec meetings, Koch donor summits, Federalist Society events. They're entrenched in not only our national and state legislatures, but now they've started moving into local school board and municipal elections as well. That's what the second half of Tip of the Spear got into. We'll save that for later because, believe it or not, all of this is just one little molehill covering that huge mountain of the long con. So we want to end this first episode where the attacks on Seminar Day started, around systemic racism, poor black versus rich white schools, and the idea of school choice as a free market cure-all for any lingering issues of race or class, as advocated by Dan, Betsy, Pat, John Tillman, and every other person getting rich or earning a living in the service of the Shadow State Policy Combine. Because race, class, politics, economics, and education all coalesced around one important figure over the last 50 years, and he also had a huge presence in our local discussion around Seminar Day, too. That is Chicago economist Milton Friedman. So Friedman was a staunch and early supporter of school choice. In fact, this is a clip of him from his seminal PBS series Free to Choose, which was released way back in 1980 at the very start of the Reagan era, and it was him talking about school choice.
The system is not working, and it is not working because it lacks a vital ingredient. The centralization produces deadening uniformity. It destroys the experimentation that is a fundamental source of progress. What we need to do is to enable parents, by vouchers or other means, to have more say about the school which their child goes to, a public school or a private school, whichever meets the need of the child best. That will inevitably give them also more say about what their children are taught and how they are taught. Market competition is the surest way to improve the quality and promote innovation in education as in every other field.
Okay, so that's Milton. Now, to his credit, he was discussing complex and lofty ideas, so he gets props for that. And he was willing to share opposing views on the show, too. So here's another clip from Free to Choose in discussion with Milton.
I think your remarks about free competition are very unfair for a very simple reason. You cannot have free competition where one group of schools must accept every single student who comes along, no matter what his physical or emotional handicaps or other problems. Now, the public schools have to take the handicap, must provide bilingual education, must engage in busing or other programs in terms of integration, must do all of these things, whereas the private school can come along and say, well, if your child has no problems, you know what we can do? We can offer you a school where you don't have to sit next to a child with these other problems. We're going to put you next to other children who are advantaged.
I think in the real world there is no competition between private schools and public schools, because private schools, especially parochial schools, do not have to comply with federal and state mandates and constitutional limitations and things of that sort.
Dr. Andrig. I think the role of public education in a democracy is not akin to that of the marketplace. The purpose for the common school is not the same as the purpose for the marketplace. We are trying in our public schools to create a democracy, to create an educated electorate. If you're going to do that, you have to have the common school.
The one unsurprising thing about these comments is that all of the opposition to allowing the market work comes from people who have a very strong vested interest in the present public school system. I am not proposing, we are not proposing to destroy the public school system. We are only asking that the public school system should be free to compete, should be open to competition. If it is really as good as you people make it out to be, it has nothing to worry about.
All right, so these are the concerns that some experts addressed to him in 1980, 40 years ago. Right? And if you notice Friedman's rather snide response, he said that all the opposition comes from those with a vested interest in the current system. Right. So all the people that are in public education are somehow selfish and greedy and have ulterior motives, but somehow There will be no vested interest in or questionable intent from those that are pushing privatization, right? So now fast forward to Betsy DeVos's confirmation hearing after Trump was elected.
I share President-elect Trump's view that it's time to shift the debate from what the system thinks is best for kids to what moms and dads want, expect, and deserve. Parents no longer believe that a one-size-fits-all model of learning meets the need of every child, and they know other options exist, whether magnet, virtual, charter, home, faith-based, or any other combination.
Okay, so did Betsy DeVos have a vested interest? Yes, she did. She was an early investor in something called K-12 Inc., which is a for-profit virtual charter school company, and we'll cover that one in detail because it's basically a criminal enterprise. Okay, so there's potential conflict of interest. But had Betsy solved somehow the potential problems around exclusion, which Friedman's detractors had pointed out would disproportionately harm minority or disabled kids 40 years ago? Well, not based on her 60 Minutes appearance.
She's now considering scrapping the Obama-era guidance on how to identify, avoid, and remedy discriminatory discipline, which aims to prevent schools from punishing students of color more harshly than their white classmates.
We are studying that rule. We need to ensure that all students have an opportunity to learn in a safe and nurturing environment. And all students means all students.
Yeah, but let's say there's a disruption in the classroom, and a bunch of white kids are disruptive, and they get punished, go see the principal. But the black kids are, they call in the cops. I mean, that's the issue, who and how the kids who disrupt are being punished.
Arguably, all of these issues, or all of this issue, comes down to individual kids. And it does come down to individual kids, and often comes down to I am committed to making sure that students have the opportunity to learn in an environment that is conducive to their learning.
Do you see this disproportion in discipline for the same infraction as institutional racism?
We're studying it carefully and are committed to making sure students have opportunity to learn in safe and nurturing environments.
All right, so we need to wrap things up now. I know this is an awful lot to hit you up with on our first episode. I'm so sorry, but we are at real risk here, folks. As a country, as a democracy, I mean, this is real. And many of the institutions that we cherish and the freedoms we take for granted are under attack. It's a stealth attack by the policy combine on behalf of these billionaire oligarchs. And they are all lying about their efforts, okay? I can't say that enough. That is what makes this a con. They're not only lying to those of us who disagree with them, but they're lying to 99% of us, all of the conservative supporters who support them as well. So I want to end with two little clips set back home in Indiana, my home state, about public education. And these are clips that really show and illuminate the current risk and the historical trajectory that's at play here in the long con. That's what this is all about. So the first is from Betsy DeVos' congressional hearing in 2018. She was already Ed Secretary. She appeared before a House subcommittee to discuss her 2018 proposed education budget. And she was grilled about a private religious school in Bloomington, B-Town, Indiana, home of Indiana University and the Hurricane Hoosiers, that was getting tax dollars for voucher kids. But it was banning kids who were gay or had gay parents.
Would you, in this case, say, we are going to overrule and you cannot discriminate, whether it be on sexual orientation, race, special needs, in our voucher programs? Will that be a guarantee from you for our students?
For states who have programs that allow for parents to make choices, they set up the rules around that.
So that's a no. Do you see any circumstance where the Federal Department of Education under your leadership would say that a school was not qualified? What if they said, we are not accepting African American students, but that was okay with the state? Does the state trump? Do you see any situation where you would step in? Would you say to Indiana that school cannot discriminate against LGBT students if you want to receive federal dollars? Or would you say the state has the flexibility in this situation?
I believe states continue to have flexibility in putting together their programs.
So if I understand your testimony, I want to make sure I get this right. There is no situation of discrimination or exclusion that if a state approved it for its voucher program, that you would step in and say, that's not how we're going to use our federal dollars. There's no situation if the state approved it that you would put the state flexibility over our students. Is that your testimony?
I think a hypothetical in this case
It's not a hypothetical. This is a real school applying for that receives
lady's
dollars.
time has expired, but I'm going to allow the secretary to answer.
I go back to the bottom line is we believe that parents are the best equipped to make choices for their children's schooling and education decisions, and too many children today are trapped in schools that don't work for them. We have to do something different. We have to do something different than continuing a top-down, one-size-fits-all approach. And that is the focus, and states and local communities are best equipped to make these decisions and framework on behalf of their
I am shocked that you cannot come up with one example of discrimination that you would stand up for students.
So notice, Betsy DeVos said a couple of times that this should be a states' rights issue, right? To protect minority and vulnerable kids. It should be left up to the states. And that the federal government, for which she is the ranking official, by the way, should keep out of it. All right? States issue, keep the federal government out of it. So here's the other clip I want to play. This is from more than 50 years ago, 1963 or 4, somewhere around there. And it comes from Ball State University, another college town, Muncie, Indiana. And they actually hosted a rather controversial speaker at the university, segregationist Alabama Governor George Wallace.
This civil rights bill turns your school system over to the federal government. And I'm not for that. I believe that you in this state should run your schools.
All right, so I think the comparisons there are pretty self-explanatory. But the other thing that Betsy DeVos said, and that she repeats like a mantra, is that parents should make the decisions for their kids. Parents are the best equipped to decide. Public schools shouldn't force parents to abdicate their decision-making. And although I think none of us would disagree with the sentiment, the issue is that they are fighting every effort as they go to hold private schools accountable or to make laws or policies that allow and encourage any of these schools to be open and transparent. They lie to parents. They give false information as part of their free market approach, quote unquote, and they think that that's okay. And this is the heart and soul of the long con, my friends. Withholding information or disseminating false information at the same time that you claim that a system is open, free, and fair, and then making billions of dollars while you encourage people to make poorly informed decisions. So, again, welcome to the show. Hope you had some fun. We have some amazing episodes coming up. Our next 2 episodes are going to feature a friend of mine who is a very smart and funny guy. You'll be happy to hear. Jeff Rogers will be with us, and we'll be talking about our kind of structure for this show, something we call the 10 and 10, or the 10 stages of the long con, the 10 facets of the war on democracy. You can see those online on Facebook. Please support us there. Our website is longconpod.com. You can tweet at us at longconpod. We would love to have a discussion. We're posting more videos. We're going to have some events. This is such an important topic, folks, and there is sunlight. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and there is light at the end of the tunnel, because as long as we, as American citizens, can come together and put aside all this political, divisive craziness that they want us to engage in, we can see just who is doing damage to this country and just what it means to the future and sanctity of democracy. So, on that happy note, this has been the first episode of The Long Con. And, stay with us. Hello? Are you with us? It's going to be okay.